Welcome all. My name is Jeff Shazinski, and I'm with the National Center for Appropriate Technology, which also directs the USDA-funded ATRA National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service. I will be assisting in today's webinar, Promoting High-Quality Conservation on the Organic Farm. We have two excellent presenters for today's webinar. First of all, Jo Ann Baumgartner, who is Director of the Wild Farm Alliance. Jo Ann works on conservation, food safety, and organic issues, and is co-editor of Farming and Fate of Wild Nature. Before joining the Wild Farm Alliance in 2001, Jo Ann addressed sustainable dairy, produce, fiber production topics, was senior editor for Life on the Edge, a book of California's rare wildlife species, and was an organic farmer for over a decade. Joining Jo Ann will be Harriet Behar, who is an organic specialist with the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service, or MOSES, and has more than 15 years' experience as an organic inspector of crops, livestock, and processing facilities, in addition to more than 30 years of experience in the growing and marketing of organic crops, vegetables, and livestock products. She and her husband have an organic farm near Gaze Mills, Wisconsin. This webinar will provide conservation professionals and farmers with information on how the Natural Resources Conservation Service practices and enhancements can provide high-value production and biodiversity benefits, while at the same time aiding producers in obtaining or maintaining their USDA organic status. NCAT MOSES and the Wild Farm Alliance are part of a 4-year National Conservation Innovation Grant project with the NRCS, whose goal has been to better integrate sustainable and organic agriculture production systems into NRCS programs and procedures. This is the last of a total of 9 project webinars produced for this project. A link for accessing previous webinars will be provided at the end of this presentation. As we proceed, we encourage you to type in your questions that is available on your screen. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentations where we hope to answer as many of the questions as time allows. You can also email the presenters today, as well as contact NCAT at our 1-800 hotline at the ATRA project at 1-800-346-9140, or if a Spanish speaker at 1-800-411-3222. If you didn't get those numbers, we'll have them posted later on in the webinar. Also, at the end of the webinar, we will provide a very short evaluation. Please help us make these webinars better by providing your feedback. The 11 organizations who are joining with NRC and NCAT in this effort are the Center for Rural Affairs, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service, the Organic Farming Research Foundation, the Virginia Association for Biological Farming, Florida Organic Growers, Kansas Rural Center, the Wild Farm Alliance, the Land Stewardship Project, and Practical Farmers of Iowa. So let's begin.
So welcome everyone. This is Harriet speaking. And so we were thinking about this webinar and why we wanted to be promoting high-value conservation practices. And it just seems about every week we get another study about various ecosystems in decline, the list of at-risk species growing. I know there was just a new study, I think, put out by the Audubon Society about a lot of our wild waterfowl and songbirds were at risk. And of course, we know about the pollinators. We have formerly very common bumblebees that are now on the verge of extinction. We have issues with monarch butterflies being at only 20% of their historical populations. We have lots of issues with amphibians, frogs and turtles and snakes. We have the raptors and songbirds. And of course, even mammals are at risk due, in many cases, to loss of habitat, a decline in the quality of their habitat, and loss of food sources for this biodiversity on our planet. Next slide. And of course, we have the passenger pigeon who could help us understand what happens when we lose something, and it's very sad. And of the 200,000 plants of animals now known to exist, fully 1/3 of them are at risk, with many very close to extinction. And so we'd like to stay away from that E word and try to protect and enhance what we have, and maybe even help bring back some of those numbers. Next slide. Really, we're at a point in our history here on the planet where we need to be looking beyond doing agricultural production that is damaging. And we even need to move beyond being environmentally benign to doing things that are environmentally beneficial in order to turn around some of the problems that we have. The dead zone at the base of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico is a very good example of that. We really do need to be looking at what we do and changing that to bring back some of the things that we know that we can. And if we help Mother Nature along, she's very good at healing the planet. And so these two pictures here is kind of a before and after, where rotational grazing and really protection, we're not taking that land out of production. And as a matter of fact, by doing environmentally beneficial practices, we can actually improve the agricultural production as well as improve the overall environment. Next slide. For organic farmers and ranchers, they have a special affinity for protecting their ecosystems. Because they cannot use many synthetic products that are typically used in conventional agriculture for the management of weeds and insects and plant diseases, as well as livestock pests and diseases, because they're not approved for use under the National Organic Program, they approach agricultural production from a different viewpoint, where they look at it to develop systems that prevent the problem to begin with, as well as offering ecological services that will help them with pest control, with disease control, from simple things like having a better crop rotation, which would prevent erosion or recycle nutrients. And we also think about high-value conservation through doing practices that have multiple benefits. So, for instance, cover cropping, we can put in cover crops, but if we put in cover crops that flower, we're getting not only the erosion control and water quality management that we so value with cover crops, as well as if it's a legume, you get the nitrogen fixation. But if you let those cover crops flower, then we provide pollinator habitat as well as food sources for pollinators and other beneficials. Next slide. So many of you listening, I know, are agricultural professionals, either with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, with county conservation departments, or work with non-government organizations. And organizations such as Trout Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited can work with landowners to help them understand during a farm walkover how to identify places within their ecosystems on the farm where they can do improvements. Of course, many of us know that a lot of the land in the United States is privately owned, and many of those landowners really do want to know more how they can be better stewards of their land. Many of them have an emotional attachment to that land because they grew up there, it's their grandfather's place, or they remember fishing there as a child, and they want to see that land preserved for their next generations as well. So when you're out there walking the property with the landowner, we hope that this webinar will help stimulate you on various programs within NRCS that we consider as having multiple value, multiple benefits, and are considered by us to be high value, and educate those landowners on how to implement those practices and why they would want to. And so not only does high-value conservation offer benefits to the environment, but there's so many benefits to the quality of life for those who live and on that farm or visit that farm, and of course, protection of those resources for future generations is something very important as well. Next slide.
Hello, everyone. This is Jo Ann Baumgartner. Organic farmers rely on biological factors supported by high-quality conservation. They rely on insect and mammals for pest control. They rely on honeybees and native bees and others for pollination. They rely on predators to control rodents and microbial suppression of pathogens for food safety. They rely on microbial suppression of plant and soil diseases. They rely on microbial nitrogen fixation and digestion of compost for fertility. Next. They rely on other biological factors such as natural areas that give wildlife what they prefer. Predators eat natural prey instead of livestock, and wildlife move through habitat rather than in the farm where they may contaminate it or eat it or damage it. They rely on vegetative buffers and diversions that filter and divert runoff and intercept drift and conserve soil and protect water quality. They strive not to kill pollinators and other beneficial insects while they're working on pest and weed control, and they leave non-crop vegetation that supports species such as the monarch butterfly, as opposed to GMO crops where herbicides are sprayed to kill everything but the crop. They also rely on mechanical and cultural means. Fencing sometimes is needed so they can coexist with wildlife. Another example is row crop covers are used to exclude insects. Next. The National Organic Program, NOP Regulations, cover many types of operations, and operations include crops, livestock, wild harvesting, and processing. So general natural resource regulations include biodiversity conservation, which is part of the definition of organic production. Operators must also maintain or improve their natural resources, and the preamble talks about how they should conserve biodiversity. Next. Here's the organic production definition: a production system that is managed to respond to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promotes ecological balance, and conserves biodiversity. Next. Here's the natural resource definition: the physical, hydrological, and biological features of a production operation, including soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. And as you recall, organic farmers must maintain or improve these natural resources. Next. And in the preamble, it talks about how they must initiate practices to support biodiversity and to avoid, to the extent possible, any practices that would diminish it. And they must prove that they're complying by incorporating biodiversity that's beneficial to the farm. And here's a photo of a farmer, Paul Hain, that we're working with to expand his riparian area. Next. In the livestock regulations, the NOP requires maintaining or improving soil, water, and vegetative resources as part of the pasture definition. Pastures must be maintained for livestock health. They must provide year-round shade, and they must protect natural wetlands and riparian areas. Next. Specifically for crops, they must use a vegetative buffer zone. Well, if it's needed, there should be some vegetative buffer zone to protect the crop from prohibited substances. And they must incorporate biodiversity in perennial crops for in lieu of a rotation, because you can't rotate a perennial crop. There must be something there, some biodiversity there besides the crop itself. And pest problems may be controlled with habitat for natural enemies. They must prevent crop pests, weeds, and diseases and invasive species, and provide erosion control and maintain organic matter. Next. So while biodiversity and natural resource conservation have always been part of the National Organic Program rule, it's taken a while for them to be implemented. The NOP does have a model organic system plan or farm plan with biodiversity and natural resource examples, and very soon they are slated to come out with a biodiversity and natural resource guidance. Next. We wanted to give you, start out with an overview of what all this means on one farm. And this is an image, a Google Earth image of Full Belly Farm here in California, where they make the most of their natural resource features using cultural and biological practices. They conserve the riparian woodlands for biological diversity by supporting riparian birds. Pest insects and rodents are reduced in the fields. And the riparian vegetation supports wildlife in general with food, cover, and a corridor for them to move through. The farmers also value the vegetation because it helps protect water quality, stabilize their banks, and they've managed the invasive species in the riparian area. They use vegetation on the perimeter, on the tops and bottom of the image, on their farm as habitat for natural enemies, sometimes as food crops, sometimes as buffer zones from pollution. The lower hedge row, tree row, is a double line of mostly pomegranates turning into native shrubs as you get closer to the creek. They rotate their annual crops, and in lieu of rotation for perennial crops, they have ground cover and bordering habitat next to their perennial crops. Their old almond orchard is a fenced and permanent pasture now, and they use cover crops and compost to improve their soil organic matter. Next. It's best to start within the context of the natural ecosystem that is or was present and build in conservation restoration components that support organic agriculture. So we've put this webinar together, breaking it up into these different ecosystem contexts: aquatic and wetland ecosystems, riparian areas, savanna, prairie and grasslands, desert, forests, and woodlands. Next.
So we're next going to talk about aquatic and wetland ecosystems. We're ready for the next slide. And I just wanted to say, too, that from what Jo Ann has said, I hope everyone recognizes that that organic is so much more than just the non-use of synthetics. It really is a biological system that works within the ecosystem that's there and tries to enhance it and improve it, while at the same time letting the farmer or rancher make a living with agricultural production. So the benefits, I don't know if we can go back to the previous slide. The benefits of aquatic and wetland ecosystems include clean water with higher levels of dissolved oxygen, which then of course allow for more species of aquatic animals, fish, and amphibians. When the water is clean, it's obviously better for the livestock. It provides for a safer water source for irrigation. And when there are intact wetlands, producers can actually use those wetlands for harvesting of crops such as wild rice or medicinal herbs. And in organic management, there is a regulation under the NOP that mandates that the resource of the wild harvest must be sustainably managed, meaning that it can be harvested year after year. So it protects that resource rather than over-harvesting whenever there is a wild harvest that is labeled as organic. For areas that are historically drained wetlands, as an organic inspector, I spoke with many farmers who have turned their historical wetlands that had been put into crops, perhaps by themselves or by previous landowners, and have put them back into wetlands. And they have found that those areas, the land never forgets that it was a wetland, and they would have root disease problems, they would get the tractor stuck, and they can only really grow a crop there once every 5 years. So by putting back in that wetland, it really does help the drainage of the rest of the land that they're growing crops, and then they gain the benefits that wetlands provided. Whereas when they were trying to grow crops there, it tended to be more of a problem than it was really worth it. Next slide. So here's an example. Here in the upper Midwest, Trout Unlimited is working with many landowners to work with the NRCS and do these stream bank and shoreland protection conservation practice 580. And if you notice, the slide on the left has kind of a bank that's starting to erode, and then kind of a flat area. And then the picture on the right has a newly seeded area that will be all grass, but the bank has been sloped. So when that small stream does have a snow melt or expands due to a large rain event, the water will not undercut the side of a bank and erode. Instead, there'll be grass there, and that grass does hold the bank. The other thing that this allows for is it allows livestock to then access that water. But of course, we would not want the livestock to erode away the grass cover, so it would be part of a rotational grazing system. And here in the upper Midwest, we have really found, working with Trout Unlimited, that these grassy banks hold the bank better and actually improves the water quality for our native brook trout regeneration. Next slide. Another high-value conservation practice would be putting in shallow water habitat. And this would be, there's both a conservation practice as well as a conservation stewardship program enhancement. What this does is just enhances the diversity of the ecosystem by allowing frogs and other amphibian life to have habitat for reproduction as well as food sources. And it is a wonderful thing to hear those spring frogs calling as far as quality of life. And it's just something that organic farmers perhaps might be a little bit more willing to adopt because they're so focused on improving the diversity and health of their ecosystems. It doesn't necessarily provide for an agricultural production improvement to their farm, but anything that improves their overall ecosystem is viewed favorably by many organic farmers and conventional farmers as well. Next slide. For wetland restoration, as I was talking earlier, there is a practice standard that will help farmers take what has been cropland and then restore it back to a wetland. And obviously, wetlands provide many ag benefits by filtering water and increasing water storage, and the great benefits of reducing sediments, preventing nutrients and pathogens from entering other surface waters such as lakes and streams and rivers. They increase carbon storage and, of course, provide habitat for both permanent and transitory wildlife. And I know that I've heard many farmers tell me while I'm out on an organic inspection how much they enjoy having the wetlands on their property, seeing the ducks and the geese come and go. And some of them have even been able to rent out land to others for hunting because they have a place where these waterfowl will come and rest. Next slide. Another practice standard under EQIP is stream habitat improvement and management, where producers can put in like we have a picture on the right, riffles. There are structures that go under the bank called lunkers where large fish can then hide and grow bigger. And you can get more and more, but there's so much quality of life as well as, offering clean water. You're just not going to have brook trout living in dirty water. So if you've got naturally reproducing brook trout in a creek on your farm, it provides quality of life, recreational and fishing privilege lease opportunities, as well as cleaner water for livestock or irrigation use. Next slide.
In intact riparian areas, agriculture supports beneficial species ideally, the raptors, the predators, and pollinators, and supports the functions of filter water, recharges groundwater, and possibly there's wild crop harvesting going on. Ideal organic management is conserving that area. In those riparian areas that have been reduced or eliminated, agriculture often uses that bottom land because it's highly productive, but there can be problems because banks are not as stable. And so organic management ideally restores some of the riparian edge so that it can function correctly. And the use of natives provide wildlife with food that they have evolved with, and incorporating the structural diversity helps support many types of wildlife. Next. Riparian herbaceous cover, EQIP 390, is plantings of grasses and sedges and rushes and other kinds of forbs that don't mind getting their feet wet. This planting, of course, is going to do a lot of what I just mentioned, protecting the soil and water quality and helping with groundwater recharge. It also helps to provide water for livestock and stabilize those banks. Conserving and restoring riparian areas can also displace invasives, which are predicted to increase because of climate change. And this riparian cover helps to reduce carbon emissions related to tractor work and herbicide use that would otherwise be needed to remove invasives. Next. Riparian buffer for terrestrial and aquatic wildlife habitat, CSP enhancement, A&M 33 establishes diverse native vegetation and controls invasive species and extends the width of the riparian zone. Extending the width is important because it makes the areas wider, the wider areas then make better connectivity for wildlife. Corridors are needed in our fragmented world more and more because of climate change. And agriculture comprises 60% of the continental U.S. when you're counting private and public crop and grazing lands. While there's 10% of our wildlands are protected, most are isolated and fragmented. So agriculture's vast footprint can help provide the needed habitat and connections to wildland, thus helping to reverse the biodiversity crisis. Next. For intact savannas, agriculture often uses that land for grazing and for wild crop harvesting. And ideal organic management is removing invasives that compete with natives. And historically cleared savannas, mimicking the natural area by interspersing trees, can help provide nesting and roosting habitat for wildlife. Next. Upland Wildlife Habitat Management EQIP 645 can help provide movement, linkages, and shelter, food, and cover, and sustain wildlife for a portion of their life cycle. These are areas where beneficial organisms can be fostered and can multiply before moving onto the farm. These uplands are ideally linked to other habitats in a regional conservation network. Next. Field border EQIP 386 supports beneficial insects, protects water quality, and stores carbon. And as Harriet mentioned, monarchs are in decline, so every chance farmers get, they should plant Asclepias or milkweed, the plant that monarchs need to survive. For predator and parasitic insects, this border gives these organisms a place to overwinter and become established. So if pests invade a crop, the beneficials are there and they can build up their numbers quickly and help the farmer. Next. Establishing pollinator and other beneficial insect habitat, CSP enhancement, PLT 15, helps again with supporting these organisms that are so helpful to the organic farmer, it protects natural resources, it helps with all kinds of support for wildlife. And pollinators are on decline, and it's not just the honeybees, but as Harriet mentioned, bumblebees. It turns out some crops are better pollinated by native bees, such as tomatoes and blueberries. And whether we're supporting the natives or the honeybees, all pollinators are going to help with improved fruit set, size, and quality. Using native plants is more optimum because they are more suited to drought conditions, and not so important here in the West. More suited than flowering ornamentals, and they need less water for establishment. Next. Alley cropping to support beneficial insects and add biodiversity, equip 311. It helps again with these beneficial organisms. Pest populations are also predicted to increase due to climate change, and instead of using more toxic pesticides, providing beneficial insects will help habitat, will help to provide habitat and mitigate that. Good management practice is to use alternate mowing of the alleyways, which will support some beneficials all of the time. Next.
So really the vast majority of the cropland that's in use in the United States used to be either a grassland or a prairie. And so there's so many things that we can do to encourage high-value conservation on these lands, either if they're currently intact as a prairie grassland, and there still are. I live in Wisconsin, and there's many acres here as well as quite a few in Iowa that are used for grazing and wild crop harvest. But we do have the issue of invasives coming in. I do know people who rotationally graze native prairies, and their cattle enjoy it and put on weight, and it actually is a good practice. And this type of grazing also then shares those grazing lands with wildlife. For the historically cleared prairie and grasslands, obviously many of them are in crops. Just think about the breadbasket of Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, Illinois. But there are places where there's the riparian areas, there are potholes, there's a whole variety of areas where there still are some native areas, even considering, just as Jo Ann was talking about, field borders around the edges of those fields. And many times you'll see organic farmers actually striving to have more field borders, smaller fields rather than larger fields, because they recognize having homes for birds and beneficial insects and wildlife is a benefit to their overall farm production. So they have those smaller fields to allow for at least some wildlife corridors within the farm. The other thing, too, is there are fields that are rocky or sandy or odd-shaped that are real opportunities or too steep to then just put in and replant those prairie and grassland native plants. And, of course, there are things that can be done where growers actually put in flowering plants within the crop to draw in beneficials. I don't have any photographs, but there's some pictures I know of, like alyssum growing in a field of lettuce. And here in the Midwest, a lot of people are doing, they grow cilantro and just let it go to flower in their fields of broccoli or kale to draw in the beneficials that are drawn to those type of plants and have them right there in the crop field. Next slide. Another opportunity for conservation plantings for organic farmers is that there are buffer zones required. Whenever organic agricultural production directly adjoins conventional production, where that farmer on the other side of the fence is using a material that is not allowed in organic production, then the organic farmer must have a minimum of 25 to 30 feet typically, And typically that could be a bare road, or it could be native plantings or trees or shrubs to protect the organic integrity of the crop. And as a matter of fact, if there is a tight planting of shrubs, they could actually have that buffer zone be even less wide in size. It's really based on, the size of the buffer zone is based on the risk of the possibility that an unintended application of that prohibited substance would fall on the organic crop. So on organic farms that are somewhat surrounded by conventional farms, there's tremendous opportunity to put in buffer zones that could offer roosting, nesting, and cover, as well as corridors for all types of wildlife. And of course, these permanent grassed or treed acres are great at storing carbon. Next slide. One conservation practice under EQIP 585 is strip cropping. And it can be done both on the contour in the slide you see on the left, as well as just in straight areas, as you see the photo in the middle. Again, like I said, the organic farmers like to have more field edges, and part of that also allows for more air movement and sun infiltration, which provides for higher yields and healthier crops that they're growing, as well as having more areas of sod in a field and slowing down the movement of that water and soil. And of course, even a totally flat field is going to have some erosion if we have a large rain event. The other thing too is that farmers can delay the harvesting of their hay crops to allow for songbirds to, ground nesting birds to fledge out, as well as fawns to grow up. And this tends to be a place where the mothers leave their fawns in that tall hay, and if you wait long enough, and they will leave. And so this provides some habitat for deer. Next slide. Another conservation stewardship program enhancement is for organic no-till. I'm not sure how many of you know about this practice, but it is somewhat still experimental, but becoming more widely adopted for its numerous benefits. What most farmers use is a piece of equipment, that red roller crimper that you see on the upper left, comes in, and when the rye is starting to head out or in the boot stage, they run that roller crimper over that rye. Typically there's a little bit of some water in there to give it some more weight, and it crimps the rye so it kills it. Then they come in with either a row crop planter, typically something that's got some aggressive coulters so it can really get through that mulch, or a drill. Or in vegetable production, they can come in with a shank and coulter operation to cut through and open a furrow, so then they can come in and transplant plants into that field. The benefits of this is that rye is planted the first year, typically at the end of August or in September. It goes through the winter with a nice cover on that land. Then it gets roller crimped and grows a crop, soybeans or corn or vegetables, that season. Then that crop is harvested, yet that mulch remains in place until the following spring. So that's really a long time, and during that time, that mulch is decomposing, feeding the soil biological life, and increasing carbon storage. So, and of course, it's done multiple benefits by retaining soil moisture and smothering weeds. So in the upper right-hand corner is a field of soybeans. And then this is probably the typical way that it's being used, is for no-till soybeans, and this method was pioneered by Rodale. Next slide. Another conservation practice, or CSP enhancement, that could be promoted to organic farmers is the making of compost. And of course, any time that we could take that raw manure and turn it into compost, we are then destroying the weed seeds, destroying plant diseases and pathogens, as well as turning that raw manure into a much more biologically stable fertilizer, which would then allow for less leaching during a high rain event. So, and there are organic farmers that would be interested in putting in a composting operation, both for their own use as well as for selling to others who see compost as a very valuable fertilizer. Next slide. Two conservation stewardship program enhancements are transitioning to organic crops and transitioning to organic grazing. So if you are working with a producer who is looking to transition to organic and they are already doing conservation on their farm, this enhancement might be a worthwhile addition to their conservation stewardship program payments or ranking. And the NRCS does recognize that by starting an organic operation on some or all of the land owned by the farmer, that there is improved soil quality, increased organic matter, and of course, much less reliance on synthetic input. Next slide.
Back to me.
Thanks, Jo Ann.
Thanks, Harriet. Hedgerows are supporting beneficial insects, equipped 422 and 380. Hedgerows are great for lots of different things as listed here. They also are providing for movement for wildlife, which we keep bringing up. And again, it's better to have animal move in the habitat than it is to move through your crop where it might contaminate it, since things are so hot with food safety these days. For climate change, woody biomasses, trees, and shrubs help with the carbon and nitrogen storage above the ground and in the roots. There was a recent study with hedgerows and riparian areas looked at where they stored 18% of the farm-based carbon while only taking up 6% of the land. Plants are best selected so that they sequentially flower throughout the growing season, so there's always some food for beneficial insects. And the image on the left, Harriet, shows a picture of a small hedgerow in the middle of a crop. And that way it's drawing the beneficials in through the crop. And we know that while they do like to hang out in the hedgerow, they will move out hundreds of feet into the fields. Next. The restoration of rare and declining habitats is supported with EQIP 643 and was such an important practice for addressing the biodiversity crisis. Shown here is a vernal pool and associated rare species, and this is one of many rare habitats. The habitats are rare either because they're endemic to the region or as likely could be because of agriculture development and or other human uses that have made them that way. Agriculture is actually responsible for listing more than 40% of the endangered species in our country, largely because of its impacts to native habitat. So helping reverse this biodiversity crisis is critical. Next. Wildlife-friendly fencing is supported with CSP Enhancement A&M 27. And fencing obviously restricts wildlife movement, but it also causes habitat fragmentation and separates herds. Even more troubling, as you see on this photo on the left, it causes numerous wildlife deaths, especially when barbed wire is used. These other images show ways of working with fencing. The one at the drawing at the top shows an adjustable wire fence is placed where there's a known migration route. The second image of the seasonal electric fence can help livestock production coexist with wildlife. The third, or the drawing on the lower part shows a laydown fence. Again, that would be placed in a known migration route. The image on the top right shows how you can simply just leave the gates open when the pastures are not being used, and that helps with connectivity. And lastly, the image on the lower right shows that putting flagging or vinyl markers improves visibility, which can be critical for wildlife that will just slam into those fences otherwise and kill themselves. Next. In the desert, intact desert is sometimes grazed or wild crop harvesting can occur, and ideal organic management is using prescribed grazing practices because especially in these dry areas, it's easy to overgraze, so thoughtful planning needs to be made related to grazing. Invasive species are ideally controlled, and livestock watering facilities are made safe. There's another practice standard or enhancement that helps with that. So, for instance, bats that come in to get a drink of water at a livestock watering facility don't drown. In historically cleared deserts, it's often just crops. So organic management ideally uses irrigation systems that conserve water, and they select crops that use less water. And when they're using water from natural areas like springs, the water is shared with wildlife. Next. Here's a farm in a desert situation where they're integrating pest management practices like those that are available and equipped 595. And on the left, the farmer has put up a bat box. It turns out that bats come out in the evening, right? But at the same time, this bat box is next to his apple orchard where there's codling moth issues. And codling moths come out in the evening too, and bats love to eat codling moths.
Change the slide. There.
On the right, there's an image of a perch that the farmer put up for songbirds like this rare willow flycatcher to make it easy for them to scour insects next to his row crops. Next. In this desert ecosystem, there are riparian areas, and the riparian forest buffer equipped 381 and also the enhancement A&M 05 help with conserving and restoring that riparian buffer. It's really important in desert systems where when there is native vegetation that is healthily restored, it can slowly release groundwater back into the stream during the drier months of the year, and that benefits wildlife, but it also can benefit livestock if they're managed correctly. So in the West, 75% of wildlife use riparian systems. Hence, these are really important. Live vegetation, standing deadwood, and rotting trees provide nesting and denning habitat for wildlife. So not just not just the plants themselves, but the whole ecosystem that they create helps to support wildlife. Next.
So also in the desert agriculture, as Jo Ann mentioned, that there are many types of micro irrigation that actually really conserve water instead of doing flood irrigation or large center pivot overhead irrigation. You can set up drip irrigation or micro sprinklers that really put the water right where the plant is, and you can see that in the photo on the left, where there's emitters right on the plants, but not in between the plants in the row or between the rows. And that's obviously going to save a lot of water and really put it where you need it. And so that's a conservation practice 441 that people can use at small scale, large scale, in high tunnels and a whole variety of areas. Next slide. So our last ecosystem is forests and woodlands. And these also are used for grazing and wild crop harvest. Invasive species and management to protect the resources are very important in these ecosystems as well. And there's a lot of interest in permaculture now, where people are really looking at having, using that land, both savanna and forest and woodlands, for a whole variety of uses, having taller trees and lower shrubs that produce nuts and berries and wood, as well as grazing livestock in a rotational way underneath. And of course, there's many things that can be done to woodland to enhance those areas, to provide more nesting cavities and snags on the forest floor, to provide for wildlife habitat. Next slide. So as I said earlier, there is a provision within the National Organic Program regulations to allow for wild crops to be harvested and labeled as organic in the marketplace. Things like maple syrup could be considered a wild crop if those trees had not been planted. Echinacea out there in the mountain states, purple coneflower, ramps, ginseng, blackberries, morel mushrooms. All these things are reviewed during the annual inspection to make sure that the producer is not harvesting it in a way that would be destructive either to the environment, and that the growth and the production of the wild crop would be sustained from year to year. Next slide. So there is an enhancement on the Conservation Stewardship Program for the biological suppression and other non-chemical techniques to manage brush, herbaceous weeds, and invasive species. And of course, if the organic farmer is interested in avoiding the use of synthetic herbicides, then this enhancement would be very useful to them. Here on my own farm, I have had some high school classes come and help me pull garlic mustard. Where I live here in Wisconsin, there's actually a company that has 3 or 4 different herds of goats that they bring to your farm with the electric fence and leave it there to clear out invasive shrubbery. And of course, that would be an opportunity for somebody else who wants to have a herd of goats to take around, because this is something that, again, many landowners, even if they're not organic farmers, would perhaps prefer not to do broad spectrum herbicide use, but would prefer to do more natural and biological suppression of those invasive species and protect those native plants, those spring ephemeral, trilliums, and things like that that are damaged or destroyed by these aggressive invasive species. Next slide. As I mentioned also, silvopasturing, which allows for forage for livestock, can allow people to do selective wood harvest for selling of wood products. And of course, this does enhance wildlife habitat, giving them a place to either roost or sleep. And silvopasturing can be done in a wide variety of ways. There could be people who plant trees for production and then leave alleyways for grass to grow. There are open areas similar to savanna. This overhead shot there in the lower left shows that there is a lot of planning that goes into some of these permaculture operations, where they really are considering different sizes and canopy heights of production that does allow for grass to grow, so then their animals can then have a place to graze. And even here in that center photo where someone is grazing sheep out in a newly planted orchard, which does 2 benefits, so that he doesn't have to mow and he gets some of that fertility. Next slide. So there's also just the benefit of supporting and conserving biodiversity on the farm, where so many birds do provide for insect control, for rodent control, and providing places, for instance, for woodpeckers to make nest holes that then in the future those are used by other species. And it's so important that that we have functioning ecosystems out there in our various areas of the country where we do agricultural production, that we are really not separate from our ecosystem, that the ecosystem depends on us to be smart in our management and for us to provide food for ourselves and our communities and the greater world. We need to be protecting our ecosystem. Next slide. As Aldo Leopold said, a good farm must be one where the wild fauna and flora has lost acreage without losing their existence. So there is a way for us to encourage peaceful coexistence between the native species and those that we choose to grow for food and fiber. Next slide. And if you need to reach us, here's our contact information. Back to Jeff.
All right. Thank you, Jo Ann, and thank you, Harriet. That was a lot of information, and we have a few questions. One is, to what extent do organic inspectors, certified organic agencies insist on this? You spoke about the biodiversity requirement of organic certification. How I guess I'm asking us how enforced is that currently?
Well, Jo Ann, I'll take that first. At this time, well, it actually is part of the regulation, and it's part of the definition of organic. And all certifiers have some questions about conservation and enhancement of biodiversity on the farm, but there has been confusion, and we're still educating both the certifiers and the inspectors on really what biodiversity means. Having been an organic inspector for many years, I know that many producers had different ideas of what that meant. Some farmers, when I would ask them about biodiversity, would talk about biological life in their soil, which of course is biodiversity. Others would talk about restoration of wetlands, and others would just say, well, I promote biodiversity by not hunting out of season, which is kind of the minimum amount that you can do to promote biodiversity. So there's still a lot of education to be done, but just recently the National Organic Program has been working with certifiers to make sure that during their audits, their accreditation audits to be approved by the National Organic Program to do certification of operations, that they are really looking at biodiversity as an important part of the farm. I will say that long-time organic farmers have a better understanding because they have seen the ecosystem benefits that they can gain by having healthy ecosystems on the farm. And it's really, I mean, that's just kind of an overall view. But many times it's the newer people coming in that we're trying to help understand where they can improve their ecosystems and how those are going to help their agricultural production.
And I would just add that the biodiversity natural resource guidance that's soon to be out by the NOP should really help to make this more of a central piece, a fundamental piece, which it actually is, but it will now be part of the compliance.
Thanks. Yeah, we just put the slide back so that you guys could contact the presenters as well, because we had a couple questions on just getting the information about your contacts.
One last thing about wild harvest.
Sure.
That during the annual organic inspection, if the producer has asked for wild harvested products to be sold as organic in the marketplace, those areas are reviewed, as well as their harvesting and handling practices. So every area that's harvested for wild crop harvest does have an annual physical inspection. All
right. Another question is, as you state, the the EQIP and the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, provide financial support to undertake many of these practices and enhancements. In your experience with working with farmers and maybe your own practical experience, Harriet, have you found this financial support sufficient? These seem like sometimes fairly complicated practices to undertake, and in terms of both technical support and resources to undertake them, have these programs provide kind of sufficient support for that change?
Well, I think that especially under EQIP, those definitely do provide. You know, they're kind of programmed to be about 75% of the cost, and so I know farmers who are putting in flowering, legumes for pollinator habitat in their field, have put in field border, and have found that very useful. I know one farmer in Iowa has worked with Iowa State, and they have found that in the fields where he has field border and lots of flowering native prairie plants, the soybeans, when grown in rotation in those fields that have the field borders, have lower concentrations of soybean aphids than fields that do not on the same exact farm. And so they've seen that even though they've had to make an investment themselves and possibly even taken some land out of production to put into these natives, it's helped them overall in not having to either have yield loss due to soybean aphid or having to use an organically approved insecticide to control those soybean aphids. Instead, they're seeing less damage to their crop because they have these native plants in place. And so I think that they're, under CSP perhaps, the payments are not quite as high, but of course that's always also tied to the level of conservation that they already have occurring on the farm.
Thanks. Another one is, do you know any examples of organic no-till in dryland systems, particularly with, and this is definitely coming from my area of the country, with less than 12 inches of moisture? We have very little moisture in Montana, for instance, and we're just, there's been some exploration, but I'm just wondering if you have any examples of that being done in more of a dryland system.
You know, I have not. I don't have experience. I don't know of any no-till organic, like rolled rye. But I will say that here in Wisconsin, where we typically do get moisture, that moisture is critical because the crop is going through that mulch, that it's really critical to get that crop to come up quickly. And so we do need moisture pretty soon after the planting of the soybean seed into the ground, because it's typically kind of going in fairly shallow because it has to go through that mulch. And so a good rain on it after it's been planted is pretty critical to get a strong stand, and then will canopy and come through that mulch in a good thick stand. However, if you're doing something like vegetables, where you might be also laying down drip tape or watering at transplanting, that might be something that would be considered usable. I'm not sure that rye would be the best crop for the mulch. There might be something better, because rye will tend, while it's growing, to pull up moisture, and I'm not as familiar with the dryland farming as far as what might be a better crop for using the rolled rye. And I know that here in the Midwest we've experimented with hairy vetch and Austrian winter pea as well as rye and winter wheat. Those are the four that I know, but there might be others, I don't know, mung beans or something that can handle a little bit less moisture that could be killed off. I'm just not sure.
I have heard that Helen Assow, who's up in your region, Jeff, has done some no-till research, and so I think I've seen some some kind of presentations about that or paper. And so I think if you were to Google Helen Athau and organic no-till, you'd find it.
Yeah, I actually, just to respond to you and folks listening, the Helen Attau's work has been mostly on horticultural and relatively smaller operations, not so much on very large grain. So I think it's still an issue, and there is research in North Dakota on this quite a bit, but then again, they're a little bit more moisture. So the moisture, as Harriet was referring to, can be critical, and so it's true that I don't think necessarily all practices can work well in every ecology as well. We're getting I'm going to try to paraphrase some of these questions that came in coming in very much at the end here. And is how do we get somebody to basically walk our fields to do this work? And they were saying, well, that organic certifying agencies, they are busy and they in some sense can't even be offering this kind of advice because they're inspectors. Anyway, I guess there was just a general like, where do we get help kind of question.
Well,
maybe you can always respond
really
to that.
The Natural Resources Conservation Service, your district conservationist or a regional conservationist. I know various states, have regions that they might have an agronomist or a specialist in prairie planting or grazing specialist, as well as those non-governmental agencies, people like Trout Unlimited or Prairie Restoration Groups or Pheasants Forever. Those type of organizations would help you identify areas where your ecosystem could be improved. And then when you get your district NRCS person out there, then you can say, I've talked to Trout Unlimited and they were telling me that this area would be just perfect for stream bank improvement and habitat for trout and that sort of thing. And then you can kind of get the ball rolling. So I would reach out to a variety of different experts and just look around in your region. Any kind of nature conservancy. I mean, there are a lot of national and regional organizations that have people with expertise that want to see those regions have improved ecosystems, and that's why they will kind of get the ball rolling with you. And then and then when you're talking to your NRCS person, you would have a better idea of what areas you might want to prioritize, and through our webinar here have certain practices that would be useful.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Sometimes land trusts, which are all across the country, will have conservationists that can help you, or at least to give you a list of people that you may want to contact.
Thank you. I think that's about it. I haven't. I think we've done a good job, and I want to again thank you and Harriet, Jo Ann and Harriet, for their work today and the presentation. Again, you can contact us at the ATRA numbers or the presenters themselves. And thank you very much. This will be archived on the ATRA site in a few days, hopefully. We don't exactly know, but you can check back with us on that. And so if you want to view the presentation again, and always feel free to ask more questions as we move down the road. Anyway, thank you everyone, and have a nice day.